The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I present the Prime Minister's statement.
That paper is published under the authority of the House. Copies are available on the table. I call the government order of the day.
Debate on the Prime Minister's statement.
Mr. Speaker, I move that this House express its confidence in the National-led government and commend its program for 2016 as set out in the Prime Minister's statement to Parliament. Mr. Speaker, isn't it great to be back? I hope you had a good holiday and members did, and what a wonderful time it was for New Zealand. What a great display of cricket yesterday afternoon by Brendan McCullum in the Chappell Hadley series. New Zealand up against Australia one more time under a national-led government, Mr. Speaker. What a wonderful result. And of course, the Sevens, a tremendous result by the Kiwis, not only just here in Wellington, but in Sydney. The Warriors, of course, at the final, and then Lydia Ko back in New Zealand on Friday to defend her Women's New Zealand Open. Mr. Speaker, but it's not just sport that has the country in good heart. So is it in so many other economic forms. We had a record number of tourists come to New Zealand this year. 3.15 million tourists came to New Zealand to enjoy our country. And no wonder they're coming, because many of them are coming to live here as well. They can see New Zealand's a great place to live under the policies of a national-led government. We're seeing more carriers flying direct to New Zealand. Emirates deciding it's not enough just to fly all those times to Australia to New Zealand, but coming direct to Auckland. And of course, Air New Zealand doing tremendously well, bringing people from the United States through their new Houston leg in Buenos Aires in Latin America. Mr. Speaker, let's just look around and see what's happening in the data that we see in the early part of the year. The ANZ Business Confidence Survey saw confidence rise to an 8-month high, with a net 23% of firms confident, Mr. Speaker. When it came to consumer confidence, we saw record sales over Christmas, and the Roy Morgan survey having us up at 121.4, a very strong result for consumer confidence, Mr. Speaker. Manufacturing activity, the December business numbers, stronger than any other month in March of 2015, Mr. Speaker, and the BNZ Performance of Manufacturing Index saw the fastest rate of expansion since October 2014. In fact, when one looks at the PMI index, Mr. Speaker, the expansion of manufacturing, this has gone up every single month since the moment Labor declared there was a crisis. 38 consecutive months in a row, and wasn't that great? And of course, when it comes to business optimism, look no further than NZIER, which said what a great result. What's happening out there? Very strong. People looking to hire. And higher they were, Mr. Speaker, when last week we were greeted with the new unemployment rate here in New Zealand, a dramatic fall to 5.3%. That is very strong performance, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, we have the third highest employment rate in the OECD. We have very strong results of growth for young people, and of course wages rising faster than inflation. Mr. Speaker, that was greeted with absolute joy by New Zealanders, with one exception. It was a great annoyance to the Labor Party, in particular to Grant Robertson, the doom merchant when it comes to employment, Speaker. Grant Robertson is worried about a robot taking his job. Now, a cynic could say, too late. One already did the job he wanted, but never fear. He's got his people working with every editor of every woman's mag around the country, getting Jacinda nicely positioned on the front of all of those, just waiting, Mr. Speaker. But Grant is so worried about work, he decided when Parliament packed up, he would go off to Paris, to the OECD, to learn about work, at the future of work. He's going to base his commission that he's setting up on that, Mr. Speaker. Here's how it went. It started at 10:30. Nice little break of an hour and 45 minutes for lunch, then a quick 20 minutes for afternoon tea, all done and dusted by 6 o'clock. An hour and a half for cocktails. That is the future of work under the Labor Party, Mr. Speaker. Job done. It was a big day. Mr. Speaker, of course, the big issue is the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP. What a tremendous trade deal this is for New Zealand, Mr. Speaker. What a tremendous trade deal. 93% elimination in tariffs, 40% of our markets covered, 800 million middle-income consumers, Mr. Speaker, $2.7 billion of value to New Zealand. So, Mr. Speaker, it had the TPP significance to the Labor Party. Do any of us know why? No. Well, we think TPP and we think Trans-Pacific Partnership. They think two-position party. That's what TPP says then, because, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to David Shearer, he rightfully said to the New Zealand Herald, this before he got a good spanking from the leader, I'll be voting for it. There's no change there. Nothing's changed my mind. The national interest analysis, fantastic. Phil Goff, he's definitely voting for it because it is, to quote Phil, the same as the China FTA taken under Labor. Helen Clark, she's a tremendous supporter of TPP. In fact, every Labor leader in the last 20 years exports TPP except the current one. Well, that actually is a bit debatable, Mr. Speaker. So when you look at Andrew Little's positions, and I will grant it, he's had more positions than the Labor Party's had leader in the last 5 years, but when you look at it, he says he hates TPP. Hates. He got asked a pretty simple question by Mark Sainsbury. Will you withdraw New Zealand from the TPP? Do you know what his answer was? We won't. He's going to kick up Bobsy Die, but no, he won't. So then I asked him, will you vote against it? Pretty simple question. He went, yeah, well, we already said if there's legislation, we don't get to vote on TPP, he said. What about pulling out? That apparently is incredibly difficult to do, even though the text, of which he's read 500 of the 6,000 pages, says you can just do it by simply putting in notification for 6 months. When he said, why won't you pull out of TPP? This was my particular favourite for the summer. He said, because we're the free trade party. Yeah, right, we are the free trade party. So when you look at his opposition, Mr. Speaker, it seems to be around sovereignty. So what he thinks is the problem is that other people, other corporations, other governments can come to New Zealand and they can put a submission in against our law. That's apparently the problem. Here's a little technical issue. First issue is quite right, they can now. In fact, anybody's free to come to New Zealand and put in a submission at our select committee. It's called Open and Transparent Government. But what did Andrew Little do at the end of last year? I know, he rushed off to Australia to go and put a submission in against their legislation. And last night, he was telling me to give David Cameron a ring so I could put in a submission about their legislation. So he's got a massive problem with everybody else doing it, except himself, Mr. Speaker. So let's just go through one or two of the myths of TPP. Sovereignty, I think you will all agree, we have covered off. Anyone is free to come and put in a submission about New Zealand, but this Parliament determines its law, and this Parliament on its own. Mr. Speaker, there is a theory out there that somehow this affects Māori. Well, it does, positively, because the text says Treaty of Waitangi is specifically excluded, and when it comes to Y262, that's excluded as well. And by the way, the wording in the TPP is basically the same as the wording in the China and Korea FTAs. Nothing new, and you didn't see the protesters out there then, Mr. Speaker, but funnily enough, you see them now. Apparently, the problem is that it was behind closed doors. That's what Andrew Little said at Ratana. The whole problem was that it was behind closed doors, except the only minor technical problem was, A, it was exactly the same in one form as any other free trade agreement we've done, including the China FTA that was concluded by Phil Goff, sitting over there, and the Labor Party, Mr. Speaker. But what's more than that, For years, the government has been undertaking consultation on TPP. We didn't wait for the text to be completed. We didn't actually wait for the national interest analysis to come out. What we actually did was we went up and down the country, including to substantial groups of iwi, including to the Federation of Maori Authorities, to FOMA. In fact, tell me there has been more consultation on the TPP than almost any other FTA that they can see, or any other things that we have done. And the last issue, Mr. Speaker, is theoretically we can be sued under the provisions of investor state. Well, don't accept my word for how difficult that is. Let me quote this for you from Phil Goff, who said, and quite rightfully so, because he actually understands what he's talking about when it comes to this area, the barrier to get investor-state dispute is very high and the chance is very unlikely. We have had investor-state in this country for 30 years. And forget about a case being won, there hasn't been a case taken in 30 years, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Andrew Little came out with quite a little doozy when he was trying to summarise his position, which, to be granted, his press secretaries must have had quite a field day with that. And he put up TPP highlights divisions in New Zealand. The right heading, I should have pointed out to them, was TPP highlights divisions in the Labour Party. Because David Shearer and Phil Goff might be prepared to say what they think, but quite a lot of MPs are out there talking to people in the business community. And names are getting named about who's quietly supporting TPP in the Labour Party ranks, Mr. Speaker. And we know why Andrew Little isn't, because every single union came out pretty much with opposition to it. And we know who elected the Labour Party caucus, not the people sitting over there, but the union movement of New Zealand. They're opposed, and that's why it is. Mr. Speaker, they are the two-position party, and it's not just when it comes to TPP. I remember in this House a very spirited debate about sending our guys, our men and women, over to Iraq to train people. I remember that spirited debate, and what great work they're doing. We saw Ramadi taken back over Christmas, people trained by our men and women. I remember that debate. At Christmas, despite Andrew Little telling us he didn't want to send trainers, by Christmas he wanted to send the SAS. They are the two-position party, Mr. Speaker. And when it comes to the flag, I'm not even going to bother. It's still on their website. Their position is still to change the flag by a referendum. Mr. Speaker, let's get to the government's agenda. It's long and varied, but employment law will be an important piece of legislation passed this year and important work done by the government. When it comes to pay equity, the government is dealing with the issues of Terra Nova, the court cases there. We are working with the stakeholders. I think we're working very constructively there. We are looking for sensible and practical guidelines that can be implemented. And, Mr. Speaker, good progress is being made. Good progress is also being made on the minimum wage, Mr. Speaker. More to come from the government on that front, but every year this government has encouraged and put up the minimum wage, and of course we're seeing wages growing faster than inflation. When it comes to legislation around minimum employment standards, Mr. Speaker, that too is going through this Parliament in 2016, along with work around the zero-hour contracts. Mr. Speaker, when it comes to the costs for employers and employees, ACC, we're going to see those costs fall by $450 million in 2016. Great work being done by the Minister and by the Ministry there. And, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to average motor vehicle costs for ACC being cut by a third down to, on average, about $130, Mr. Speaker. The business growth agenda, Mr. Speaker, it was good to see Winston Peters coming along supporting Stephen Little, our man, and, well, Stephen Joyce. That would be Andrew Little. I forgot his name. He's had so much attention recently, Mr. Speaker. But the business growth agenda there, Mr. Speaker, what's it going to do? More of the regional programs, more initiatives around tertiary education, more for ICT, Mr. Speaker, more graduates in ICT, and the rollout of 3 graduate schools around the country, the lifting of the number of engineers. It's about skills and innovation, Mr. Speaker. And when it comes to apprenticeships, a big increase in both the number of apprenticeships, those being trained, and particularly pleasing, a very big increase in the number of Māori and Pacific students doing well in our education system. We can see that with the increase in the NCEA 2 levels. We can see it through the numbers going through our universities and the successful completion rate. We can see it in our apprenticeships. We can see the growth in the Māori economy, Mr. Speaker. And all of this happened in the back of the business growth agenda with more science and innovation, and certainly the national science challenges helping to drive that. Mr. Speaker, I don't have a huge amount of time to go through all of the initiatives for education and health, but it's fair to say the government will invest more money this year, more money both in the infrastructure, supporting our education and health systems, more availability for drugs in our community, more choice for people when it comes to education, and better opportunities to equip youngsters for modern New Zealand, providing access not only to world-class education, but world-class health systems, Mr. Speaker. Infrastructure will be a big part of the government's program for 2016. This year, the government alone will spend $6 billion in infrastructure. What is fair to say, Mr. Speaker, is we build the infrastructure and the Labor protesters lie in the middle of it. But at least it's providing some use for them from time to time. But we'll be at the table with the Central Rail link, Mr. Speaker, City Rail link. We'll be there with the East-West link doing work on that. The Waikato Expressway, more roading for Christchurch, and more regional roading projects, and who could, they're still cheering, Mr. Speaker, in Taranaki about Mount Messenger, still cheering about what's been happening there. When it comes to housing affordability, RMA reform is high on the government's agenda, and for those parties who want to talk about housing affordability and the cost on business and the cost on households, there's a simple solution. Come to this Parliament and support sensible RMA legislation. The government will work with you. Mr. Speaker, connectivity is a big part of this government with the world, with free trade agreements, but also with ultra-fast broadband. For that initiative of 80% and also rural broadband. And as I said, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to housing, there'll be work in a number of areas, including more land being released, work on withholding taxes and the implementation, almost certainly for foreigners there, and of course more work on the special housing areas. When it comes to rental properties, legislation will be introduced in relation to the installation and smoke alarms in rental properties. When it comes to the environment, the important legislation around the ocean sanctuaries of the Kermadec, Mr. Speaker, 620,000 square kilometres going into an ocean sanctuary, twice the landmass of New Zealand, the equivalent of France, Mr. Speaker. What a great way to preserve our environment. And for the least well-off in our community, benefits will rise by $25 a week for beneficiaries with children from 1 April, more obligations on sole parents, a major review of child, youth and family. The review's been completed, the work is being done, and the minister's now working on that. When it comes to social housing, we'll see the transfer of social houses to provide social housing providers in Invercargill and Tauranga, new places in Auckland. And when it comes to Māori, Mr. Speaker, more work when it comes to treaty settlements, so that by 2017 all iwi who want to settle with the government can. Enormous work happening in the Te Tui Whenua Māori Act reforms. And Mr. Speaker, when it comes to security legislation, the government's working hard on the reforms being proposed in the new report by Patsy Reddy and Michael Cullen in relation to SIS and GCSB. Mr. Speaker, there'll be the small issue of the flag referendum in March. This is going to be a very, very busy year for a national-led government. We're hungry, we're energetic, we're ready to go, and unlike the opposition, we're united. We know what we stand for and we know what we stand against. We have many policies, but we're on the same page as us. We are the one-position party, and with great momentum for New Zealand. Meanwhile, the two-position party can spend the rest of 2016 arguing with each other, because they're the only people that are going to be listening to them themselves, Mr. Speaker.